Turn in your Bibles to Exodus 3, verse 1, if you're not there already. Exodus 3, verse 1. Today, as we get started here studying the Scripture, let us bow our heads and let us pray. Let us ask the Lord to be with us in this time. Father in heaven, we come before you now, Lord, just thanking you for all the blessings that you bestow upon us. Father, I pray that in this time, Lord, that you just allow us to receive your instruction through your word. Father, allow your Spirit to be upon us. Allow this to be a time where we can look to you and receive your blessing. Father, I pray that in this time that you not only do that, but you also draw us closer to you. For those of us who know you personally and running from you, Father, I pray that you allow us to be received back just as the prodigal son is received home. Father, for those of us who don't know you, Lord, I pray that you just you call them back to you. Father, because you call us to you. Lord, I pray that in this time, Lord, that you give me the words to speak. Father, I pray that they not be my words, but your words, O Lord. And Lord, I pray that you do miraculous things in the hearts of our people. All for your glory, and in your Son's name I pray. Amen. Amen. So as we get started this morning, I need to ask you a question. Have you been there? Have you been there? Have you been to the place in your life where you felt like you followed God to a certain situation and it didn't really turn out the way that you thought it would? Have you been to that point in your life where you followed God to a place and you get there and you go, God, are you sure this is the right place for me to be at? Are you sure this is where you want me? Lord, have you abandoned me? Have you left me here? I'll tell you what, I've been to this place. I've seen this place myself. I can take you to a place in Honduras. Honduras. In 2008, my wife and I, we were laying in the bed and it is pretty late at night. I can just close my eyes and I can take myself right back to that place where the humidity in there is so thick that you can cut it with a knife. You're just laying there sweating. And the only breeze that's coming through is the ocean air that's coming off of the coast. You see, we're on a mission trip here. We're staying in a mission house where they don't have AC, they don't have any of those type of deals. You know, on the brochure, the place looked very, very pretty, very nice, but they excluded all the shacks and the shanties that are surrounding the mission house. They excluded the fact that on this island, there are no air conditioning units. They excluded the fact that all the plumbing on this island is primarily outdoors. They excluded the fact that there are no cars on this island. There are just people in need of Jesus. But as I lay there in that bed, I sat there and I start reflecting back on the times when we were preparing for this trip. You see, we were preparing for this trip with our church family. A bunch of college students, a bunch of youth students, and a bunch of adults. We all planned to go to this island called Roatan in Honduras. And we were all excited. I mean, we saw God move in the ways of these students that I can't even describe to you. Some of the hurdles that they were jumping. I mean, we had so many shots and things like that we could have glowed in the dark. It was awesome. And all these students, they took it like champs. They were ready to go. They were ready to do anything to reach these people for Jesus. And we were just seeing the Lord do miraculous, miraculous things. I reflected on the time when we got to the island and we started seeing some of the conditions of the people. Started seeing the need that was actually there. Seeing how much that broke my heart. And then I started getting to the part where we got up to the mission house and we started meeting some of the missionaries there. And I'll tell you what, this wasn't a real healthy environment in this mission house. The devil was definitely doing some work there. There was all sorts of strife and anger. There was ill attitudes and emotions toward one another. It was just not a very healthy place to be in. And you're going, God, what's going on here? Out of that period of time, we got to that point, and then those strife, that struggle, that persecution from the evil one was actually starting to filter into our group. After we've seen God move and lead us to this place and all that stuff, the missionaries at that place, they decided to split us up into all these little groups. And they didn't ask our gifting or anything like that. They just kind of split us where we were to go. And we started going on these groups. And I got put on this group that I love my group because my wife was on my group and my mother-in-law was on my group. So I love my group. And then we also had another one of my college students that was on this group. And it was a good deal. But our group was assigned to go out and build this house. And it wasn't just like building a house like what you would see around here. It was building pretty much a shanty. But the trick is that this was in a marsh area where when the tide came up, it would come up about 3 feet. So all these houses were on stilts and everything else. And So you're basically building a house in almost waist-deep muck. That was a lot of fun. We'll just put it that way. As I'm doing this, I'm reflecting back on it, and I'll tell you, building a house that way is not easy. Because I already mentioned to you that there are no cars on this island, so the way that you get lumber to this house is you carry it. Well, I don't know if you guys noticed, I'm not that big of a guy. I can't carry that much stuff. And what I do carry, I'm straining as hard as I can to carry, and it's wearing me out before I even get to the site to start construction. And I got to confess to you right now, I'm not a construction guy. I'm not. I think I am. I can buy the tools, and I love having the tools, but when it comes to slinging a hammer, I'm just not built for it. And man, I will tell you what, I worked harder in those days than I think I ever had. So as I'm laying there in bed, I'm sitting there going, God, I spent a ton of money for me and my wife to come here. God, I put in all this effort to do this, and I didn't do anything. I mean, I'm horrible at building a house, man. This lady, whenever she sees a house that is done, she's going to go, okay, you guys are going to try again. And I'm sitting there, and I'm just sweating, and I'm just getting frustrated at God. I'm going, God, I know you led us here. I saw you do it. What am I doing here? Where do I go from here? I don't want to be here anymore. I feel like you left me, God. It's funny, I remember as the next 3 days kind of traveled on, I actually, in my journal, start marking off the days. Instead of, day 3 into the mission trip, I'm going 2 days left. 1 day left. And I'll tell you what, I felt abandoned in that time, but I knew God was with me. And the way that I knew God was with me was because once He revealed Himself on the last day. You see, on the last day, what happened is we actually got to show the person who was going to live in this house, the house. And I'm sitting there, I'm biting my nails. I'm going, man, this is going to be rough. This lady, she's going to go, okay, I'll stay in my old place, thank you. But once she saw it, you could see her just light up. I mean, her whole countenance changed. Her whole attitude changed. She was overjoyed. I mean, she was crying. It was amazing. You see, what I didn't know is that when I looked at that house and when I looked at the labor and all the effort that I put into it, and I'm going, oh man, I should have hired somebody else to do this. She didn't see that. She saw that house and she saw it for what it was. She saw it for us loving her. She saw it for what it could be. And because of that, God revealed Himself not only to us through her, but to her through us and through the love that we have. You see, here's the thing. Here's the reason why I'm bringing this up to you. Is because I believe there are many of us in this church, even today, that are sitting there going, God, you led me here. What am I doing? God, I'm out in the desert. You've left me here. What am I doing? And I know it's weighing on everybody who's in that position to sit there and go, do I even want to stick with this? Do I even want to walk this out? And here's the thing. God did the same thing to Moses. If you'll look in the first verse of this, let me read the first verse of Exodus 3, verse 1. It says this. It says, Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. You see, what had happened here is that Moses had fled Egypt. And Moses wasn't just anybody in Egypt. He was actually the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He was royalty. He was living in the kingdom. He was living the high life, you could say. He had anything he wanted, anything he needed, anything he could even imagine. But Moses, he flees out into the desert because he hears about his real identity and he kills an Egyptian, so he flees out into the desert. And once he goes out there, he spends 40 years in nothing. So, I mean, you can picture this. He went from the height of everything to having everything he could possibly want. Everything that could comfort his every desire to being out in the middle of the desert where there is no comfort. There is no desire. There is none of those things. You know how long Moses was out there? 40 years. 40 years. He was out in the desert for 40 years doing what? He was shepherding sheep of Jethro. You know, do you realize that shepherding sheep is actually a job reserved for very young boys, like preteen boys, like 12 to 13-year-olds in this time? If that. So can you imagine this? That Moses, he's out in the desert. He's probably 55, something like that. And he's doing the job of a 12-year-old. Can you imagine how humbling that would be? Can you imagine what his thoughts were? I'm sure he was that guy sitting there going, okay, I only have 2 years left until retirement. I only have 2 years left until I can pull the plug on this whole deal. I'm so tired. I'm so frustrated with this. I mean, everybody's forgotten me. Even God has forgotten me out here in the desert. What am I doing here? Let me just count the days until it's over. Let me just start checking those off my list so it's done. But here's something that I need to tell you. Is that God reveals Himself. When God reveals Himself, when He appears, it's oftentimes when we're at the lowest. Because that's what God does to Moses. And God does this to all of us. Here's another story I'll give you. There's a story called The Hiding Place. It's actually a movie. It's about a lady named Corrie ten Boom. Corrie ten Boom was a missionary, and she was a missionary during the time of the Nazis and everything else. And so what she would do, her and her family, they would come around and they would harbor the Jewish people. And they would find exile for them and try and get them to escape the Nazis and help them and all that stuff. Well, Corrie ten Boom, she had a heart for what God would do in her life. And she was like many of us. At one time, she prayed a prayer and said, God, I will do anything for you. Anything that you call me to, Lord. Use me in whatever way possible. I'll even be the guy behind the scenes. A little bit later after that time, the Nazis closed in on their operation. They took in her family. Miss Corrie ten Boom, she was separated from her grandfather who died in a concentration camp. She was then separated from her sister and thrown into solitary isolation. She was thrown into a box that was probably a foot by foot wide. This movie, it ends with the last scene of her sitting on the floor, huddling up against the wall, just crying out to God and saying, God, I'll do anything for you, but I didn't realize I would be alone. You see, here's the thing. Here's what I'm going to tell you about this. Although that's very sad, God did an amazing work. So when you are out in the desert, when you feel alone, when you feel hungry for God, when you feel like God has abandoned you, don't blame the desert. Because God is using that desert experience in each and every one of you, just like He did with Moses, to reveal Himself. What He's doing is He's calling you to draw closer back to Him. He's calling you to bring yourself closer in relationship with God. So if you feel like God has abandoned you, what I'm telling you is that you need to get closer with God. You need to call back to Him. You need to be spending more time in your Scriptures. You need to be spending more time in prayer to God. You need to be spending more time in worshiping with God. Because God is trying to get your attention, and He's about to do it in a big way. Let us go on to the next part about this. In verse 2 through 6, He does something very, very interesting. Which actually you may apply to some of us in the other realm of this. Maybe you aren't sitting in that pew going, I'm alone in this, or I feel like God has abandoned me in this, or anything like that. Maybe you're sitting in that pew and you're just going, maybe the reason why God isn't with me right now is because I'm too busy. Right? Maybe you're like Moses in this sense, where Moses was running around shepherding sheep and doing all that type of stuff. Maybe Moses wasn't doing the things he was wanting, or he should have been doing. Maybe he was focusing on the things he shouldn't have been focusing on. Because let's be honest here in this room, we are the masters of our schedule, aren't we? I mean, let's be honest. We run in here and to and fro and do all these other things that aren't necessarily essential for eternity. We just do things to do them, right? I mean, I hear it all the time. I hear it from people who are retired. They tell me that hey, once you retire, you actually get more busy than when you're not retired. Why is that? Well, who's making your schedule, folks? Who's doing this type of deal? What are we focusing on? I guess we are just masters of being busybodies, right? We're masters of being busybodies. We just go and go and go and we run ourselves out. But the thing is that I will tell you that being a busybody is all about our priorities. Because there are some things that we block off our schedule, don't we? Alright? Let me ask you this, or I'll give you an example of this. I was talking to a church member the other day, and I was asking them why they didn't go to a church event. Well, the reason why they didn't go to a church event is they had family coming into town. We've all been in those shoes before, haven't we? We have family coming into town. Well, there's no law saying you can't bring your family to church. I'm just going to lay that out there right there. But we set a priority there where we build boundaries around this one event. Oh, I got family coming into town, and so I'm not going to let that interrupt anything. I'm not going to let anything erupt it. It'll just be us. I'll give you another illustration about this. What if you got a phone call that on Tuesday afternoon, Mr. Johnny Football is going to come over to your house for lunch? Would you clear your schedule? Some of y'all are still bitter about the draft. Okay. 6 months ago you would have. Right? Absolutely. You'd probably even put your cell phone somewhere. You may have even turned it off when he showed up. Here's the thing. Here's what I'm telling you. Is that God is very important. And even though you're a busybody, even though you're setting your own schedule, even though you're blocking out that time, I need to ask you the question, are you blocking out time for God? Because guess what? When God appears, He's demanding our full attention. When God appears, He demands our full attention. I want you to see this in verse 5. I want you to see the response of Moses in verse 5. The command of the Lord to Moses and the response of Moses in verse 5. He says this. Then he said, do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. So what do we see first in here? Well, we see first that God gives him kind of a weird command, doesn't he? Take off your shoes. That's kind of a weird command, considering where they're at. They're out in the desert, where there are rocks, where there are thorns, where all these things. Why is he telling them to take off his shoes? The reason why he's telling them to take off his shoes is because he wants nothing in between him and God. He's saying, pull off your shoes because I want nothing in between you and me. As I'm talking with you, there should be nothing in between us. There should be no distractions. There should be no sinful behaviors. There should be no other desires, but focusing on who I am in front of you as I give you my commands. As you're worshiping me, focus on me. That's what God's telling Moses. Because here's the thing, is that when we take our shoes off, can we go out and do other things? No. Moses couldn't keep tending sheep if he had his shoes off, did he? No, he couldn't. He wouldn't get very far. He may go a foot or two and go, ow, 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 right on the rocks. He couldn't get very far with his shoes off. He's saying, focus fully on me. What else is he telling Moses? He's saying, be still. Sit down. Wait a while. Stop what you're doing. Stop focusing on these other things. Focus on God. Here's what I'm telling you, ladies and gentlemen. Here's what I'm saying to you today. If you're in that place where you're either a busybody or you feel like the Lord has left you, and you feel like you're in that spiritual desert, no matter which camp you're in, here's what's God telling you today. He's saying, take off your shoes. Don't go anywhere. I want nothing in between you and I. I want you to sit there and listen to what I'm telling you. I want you to rest in the Lord. I want you to have my peace. So how do you do this practically? What does that look like within your life? Well, I'll tell you. Maybe it may physically look like you taking off your shoes. Maybe it means that you get up in a recliner somewhere and you take off your shoes and you have a conversation with God and you start confessing your sin to Him. You start saying, God, look, I messed up all that other stuff. Maybe it's confessing not necessarily a specific sin like lying or gossiping or something like that, but maybe it's just confessing the fact that you haven't put Him in the first priority of your life. Maybe it's a little bit of time where you just sit still with God and you don't do anything else. You turn off your cell phone for 2 or 3 hours and you spend time with God. And you read His Word. And you pray. And you write down what the Lord tells you. Because that's what God calls us each to do. He's calling us to put Him first on our priority schedule. So what am I telling you here? I'm telling you this, is that the great tragedy in our world today is we fill up our schedule so much that we miss God in the process. We don't block out time for Him and His will in our lives. We don't take time to hear the calling which God has placed on each and every one of our lives. Let's move on to this next set of verses. Now I want you to see an overarching theme to this. In verses 7 through 10, the overarching theme is this. It says, when God appears, He has a purpose. Read with me in verse 7. In verse 7 it says, then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and I have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land, to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. So as we look at those verses, we see something. We see this, is that when God appears, he has a purpose, and he reveals that purpose in verse 7. So what is his purpose? Well, his purpose is this, is that he's heard the cry of the people. He's heard of those people who are in distress, who need help, and he's heard that. And so what is his purpose? His purpose is to raise up his man in order to go and help those people be released from that bondage. You see that? When we see this within the text, I can't help but identify with that. Because here's the deal. I know there are many of us in this room that are sitting there going, man, I just don't know if I have a calling from God. I don't know if I have a purpose to this life. Well, I'm going to tell you, God has even revealed that purpose within this. Because guess what? God's not done calling his people. God still has a purpose for each and every one of us. And that purpose is this, is that God has heard the cries of the people that are in bondage. Now, it may not be a slavery type bondage, is what you may be picturing in your mind, or what is written about directly within the context of this verse, but it is a slavery type bondage in the slavery of sin. Because here's the deal, is that just like God has heard the cries of these people, he hears the cries of those who are away from him. And our sin separates each and every one of us from God, doesn't it? Absolutely it does. And because God has heard that cry, he did something about it. He sent a purpose. He sent a man to fulfill a purpose. And that man, who was also his son, God himself, Jesus Christ, to die on the cross for each and every one of our sins, to be buried for 3 days and raised again 3 days later. And so when you sit there and you ask yourself, what is my purpose in this life? Well, your purpose in this life is simply this, to go and tell people about Jesus. Because guess what? Each and every one of us are that Moses in our life. Each and every one of us are that person in our lives that the Lord is calling out. The Lord is calling to. Now, you may not have seen a burning bush per se, but the Lord is calling you each out to go out and share his gospel and to share his word. Do you see that within this text? Do you see what he's telling you? So let me ask you this. What is God calling you specifically to do? What is God calling you specifically to do? As we look at this text, and we know that God is calling each one of us out, what is he asking you specifically to do? Because God had a specific calling for Moses in this thing, to go to Pharaoh and let his people go and call him to release the people from him. What is he calling you specifically to do? We each have a general call in our life. What is he calling you specifically to do? It's something that we always have to ask. And if you don't have that answer, maybe it's time you sit before God. You slow things down, you take off your shoes, and you sit before God. Now Rick is going to come up here and he's going to start the invitation. And I need to ask you, what is God calling you to do? He may be calling some of you guys to just slow down. Start making him the number one priority in your life. Others of you, he may be calling to start a relationship with him. Others of you, he may be telling you something different. The message was short, and it was sweet, and it was simple. I don't need to belabor it. We just have to respond. So the question is, how will you respond? What is the Lord calling you to do? The altar's open. If you need to come pray, come pray. If you need to seek the Lord, now's the time to do it. If you need to make a public decision, I'm standing here. Let's do some business with the Lord.